All right, so mixing snares for modern heavy music has to be one of the most frustrating aspects of the mix. It's just so much variation in the source sound that you get, you know, different drums, different heads, different amounts of muffling, different drummers, different tunings, different mics, different mic positions, different amounts of processing on the way in. Just makes it really tricky to have a one-size-fits-all approach. I mean, I think that's basically impossible, unless you were to use just the same samples or only record the snare drum in one particular way so that the same kind of EQ and compression moves work. But I think what's way better is to actually kind of train your ear a little bit to be able to pick out the most important aspects of the frequency range from the snare top and snare bottom tracks in order to be able to achieve, you know, be able to listen for and equalize the frequencies in a way that you like. So that's what I'm hoping we're going to go over in this tutorial. Everything I do, you might not like the frequencies that I choose to be boost or cut, but the main thing is just to be listening and kind of paying attention to the process so that in the future you'd be able to find the frequencies and bits that you do like that you want to take from this and apply it to your own mixes. Before we get into working with some of the sampled snare drums from the GGD sample libraries, first of all, I'll just show you we've got a set of live drum tracks here. Shout out to my friends and ex-bandmates Robin and Jake, who formed a project called Teller. But yeah, this track was called Victoria. Really, really good drumming on it. Good recording, I think. A few years old now, but still stands up to the test of time. This is what it sounds like. Cool. So as you can see, if you were to look closely at this track, we've got a kick trigger track and there's a snare room trigger as well, but natural direct snare. And we're just going to skip straight from that. I'm going to get rid of the real snare and I'm going to pull up a sample library of ours called Invasion. This is our kind of metal focused library. And I've never actually done a mixing tutorial using Invasion. So I've got rid of all of the kit pieces, and it's a really big kit normally, apart from the snare drum. And I've chosen to use the Brady Tasmanian Blackwood snare, which is a really awesome snare drum lent to us by Mike Mallion for this session, so shout out to Mike. It's actually in a similar kind of tuning range to the real snare from this session, but it's not exactly the same. And I've converted, well, firstly, I've got rid of all the mics apart from just the snare top and bottom channels, and I've routed them out to two separate channels here on my mixer, labeled snare top and bottom, feeding to this Invasion snare. The MIDI that I've generated for this is all programmed at relatively sensible velocities. So this is always a top tip I have, is don't just program your snares at 127 all the time. The drum samples that we record are recorded up to like stupidly hard hits, and while that can be cool for a specific vibe, I'd say most of the time you're going to get a better tone out of the drum actually pulling it back. I think about 110. Yeah, I'm programming at 110 here. That seems to be about the right area there for like just a solid rim shot on the snare that would kind of equate to probably roughly how hard Jake's hitting in the natural drum tracks you just heard. The Invasion snare bus is running to a drum bus. I've got a distressor style compressing thing going on, which I've outlined in a previous video about the Periphery 4 drum library, into what I used to use as my top-down EQ on my mix bus. I now have it simply on the drum bus. I've kind of moved on from applying that to the whole mix. If you want more information about that, you can see a couple of previous tutorials that will link below. I've talked about that also in my Creative Live tutorials and the Nail the Mix one as well. So I'm not really going to go into depth of that because you can find the information elsewhere, and if you wanted to, you could screen grab those settings. Furthermore, that's running into a master bus which has my kind of standard fast attack, fast release SSL style compression. Also a little bit of compression from, that's using the Slate FG Grey. Also a little bit from the Slate FG Red kind of Focusrite style bus comp with the mix turned down low into a limiter. So there is stuff going on after the snare drum. It's not really the point. I just want you guys to be able to hear it going from, you know, from initialized with no plugins on the snare, close mics, all the way up to the final drum mix. So real snare is muted. I'm going to mute the snare room trigger as well, just because that's going to be a little bit confusing. And this is what it sounds like just out of the gate with nothing on the Invasion snare channels. Halfway through, I just put the snare bottom channel back up to Unity so you hear it exactly as it's coming out from Invasion. So that's obviously, you know, it sounds like a raw snare drum. And these are just completely raw. The invasion session, we did literally nothing to the signal on the way in. So it is just about the kind of, the most basic starting point you can be at when you're mixing a snare drum. And the first thing that I want you guys to try doing, if you're having difficulty EQing your snare drums, is to use a transient designer. You could put it directly on the channel. Here I have it on the snare bus, and pull the sustain all the way back to zero, as I've done here, using Native Instruments Transient Master, which I think is really good and not very expensive. The reason why we do that, now I think the primary issue with mixing snares in modern heavy music is the fact that you get your drum mix, you can hear all the details of the sustain of the drum, the snare fizzle, the room, and then you chuck some basically huge rectangular waveforms, which are the heavy guitars and maybe the bass to some extent on top of that, and you just get this effect like you're only now hearing just the tips of the icebergs, the kind of brief spike at the front of the snare drum, and then the rest of that information is getting eaten up by the guitars. Now there's stuff you can do with parallel compression, transient designers, whatever, to bring the tails up more, but the really tricky thing with drums in general, I think, is how much of the sound your ear has to latch onto just in that initial transient spike. And that, I think, is where you need to get some skills and some experience, because that's a difficult thing to do, like to register within a few milliseconds the kind of frequency response of something. And especially when the sound itself is continuing on for longer than that initial response, your ear is getting distracted by the sustain of the drum, the ringing overtones, the fizzle of the wires, anything else that's going on in the sustain of the drum. And that's a completely different frequency response than the initial attack, where you've got all of that high end and kind of upper mid accentuation from the stick hitting the drum. So lots of talking. I'm trying to make this concise. I actually am shooting this for a second time around because I felt like I was too waffly the first time. So I'll show you what happens. Put the sustain on zero on the transient designer. You get rid of all of that other information. We can now work on the snare drum in solo without distraction of other instruments, and yet get a much better impression of the bit of the snare drum that you can actually hear when you put it into the mix. So this is what it sounds like with that happening. Cool. You guys probably all have a good idea about what Transient Designer does already at this point. So I won't spend too long explaining that. What I'm going to do now is solo the snare top, and this is where we're going to get into EQing. We're going to leave this Transient Designer thing in place. I'm going to pull up FabFilter Pro Q3, and what I want you to do is to listen to what feels like the frequencies that are the leading edge of the sound. Like, what frequency range is the first thing that's hitting your ear and is the predominant sound in that little spike of information? I already know from listening to this that, you know, and from working on other snares too, there tends to be kind of three areas. It's like the kind of flappy, kind of clunky sound that tends to be kind of down around 400, 500 hertz, usually around 500-ish. There tends to be like a kind of clacky sound, which is that kind of like 1K area. And then there tends to be all manner of, you know, it could be more of like a harsh attack or a kind of ticky attack, which would be even higher up still. That's your kind of like upwards of 5K area. And those are the areas which you should really try and train your ear to pick out and kind of identify how much of those are leading the sound in this little blip of information that you're hearing. So I'm going to hit play, and I'm going to, first of all, just try and find that kind of, yeah, that kind of flappy character that I reckon is going to be around 500 hertz. Of course, I'm working on an EQ plugin that has a visual analyzer, so that's kind of giving us quite a big hint, because you could see there's a bit of a kind of triangle around there anyway. But that is the frequency area which I'm really hearing leading the sound. If I mute it, kind of bob, 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 bob. That's silly, isn't it? You know, I'm making all of these sounds with my mouth, but I think it's a really useful thing to do when you're working, or even if it's just in your head, if you're thinking about, like, does the sound have more of like a ta character or a ka or a pa? All of those are like different amounts of low end in the sound. You know, for me, a modern rock metal snare has a lot of that kind of plosive sound to it, which we'll get to later, introducing a bit of a low bump if it needs it. And if you're not, you know, if what you're hearing sounds more like a kind of a K sound, a ka, then it's probably got more of upper mid-rangey kind of attack than anything else. And if it's tad, then you've got very little low end altogether. So yeah, I'm being silly in the video. It was probably sound like a lunatic of some sort, but yeah, I think it's actually quite worthwhile doing that little exercise for yourself. So having identified that area, I'm going to cut it to see where that takes me. So cutting it down to around there, for me, is making it no longer the leading edge of the sound. We're not necessarily trying to just scoop it all out. But having cut that, I'm now noticing these upper areas of the attack a bit more, the kind of clackiness, and then there's like a kind of tickiness as well. So let's head up to around 1K and see what we can find there. So yeah, about 1.2K, I'm getting quite a lot of that kind of clacky character. And then yeah, there is this kind of high plasticky character, like a kind of ticking sound, which I'm going to find. I mean, yeah, like I said, I'm going to see where it is on the spectrum analyzer, but you know, you could do this on more kind of analog style EQs if you'd rather not have that visual information to train your ears more. So I also brought down the one that was around 1.3K, as it turns out, a little bit more. And the more you scoop that area, the more scooped, the more kind of woody, the kind of less harsh the drum sounds. So, you know, some mixers scoop a lot of that kind of like 900 to 1.5K area out of their drums, and it gives it a specific character. Be careful, it can also strip some of the character of the actual instrument itself out, so it's kind of up to you to find the right balance there. So having addressed those frequencies, I now want to look at the fact that I feel like this drum doesn't have much of that low-end power, that kind of plosive character that I was talking about earlier. And I'm going to do a little move that I really like doing on snare drums, using a low shelf. So I'm going to bring up a low shelf here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the Q value of the shelf. So if I just boost the shelf with a normal Q, looks like you expect, if I push the Q higher, we get this kind of bump on either side of the frequency point. And this is really cool because we can accentuate the fundamental tone of the drum with this kind of bumped part of the shelf here, while at the same time subtracting a little bit of what's there above, because the issue can be, if you're doing more of that traditional like bell boost at 200 kind of hertz, which is what a lot of people talk about, you end up bringing up some muddiness above it around that 300, 400 frequency range. So this is a little bit of like kind of give with one hand and take with the other. So you just need to not pay too much attention to like the amount of dB boost or the frequency, or at least, you know, the settings that you'd usually use aren't going to translate, because as you can see, the bump here on the frequency range falls around about 200 when the actual midpoint of the shelf is at about 270. And likewise, it's peaking above 6 dB, even though it's saying plus 4.5-ish. So yeah, just, you know, you can use your eyes a little bit for that as well, and definitely use your ears. So I'm going to turn the gain all the way back down again, and I'm going to hit play, and then you'll see what happens as we turn that gain up. So just kind of tune it until you feel like you're getting that kind of little punch of low end on the fundamental tone of the drum. It might turn out that's a little bit excessive and we kind of have to reduce it a little bit later, but I really like doing that up front to the snare top. And then we can do a bit of EQing on the bus. So let me just show you now what the snare top microphone sounds like if I get rid of the transient designer, cutting all the sustain there. So this is what it sounds like currently, and then I'll bypass. And if I bypass the EQ, it's a pretty stark difference, I think. And this is a lot more pleasing on the ear. Admittedly, we are losing some of the ring, as I say, if you want to, you can fiddle with this kind of 1K value. You could maybe make it a dynamic band so that it's kind of cutting on the initial transient and then kind of swooping back up again to allow some of the overtones through. But yeah, I'm going to leave it at that. I'm going to put our transient designer back on again, and I'm going to work on the snare bottom channel. So this is what that sounds like. Instantly, I'm hearing like a mid-range forwardness to that sound, a kind of flappiness to it. So I'm guessing it's going to be around 500, maybe a little bit higher up. This doesn't need to be the most exact science in the world, but yeah, I'm kind of hearing this up more kind of close to 800. If I cut that, let's take a listen to what the snare bottom sounds like. A lot of the time, the snare bottom channel, if it's captured well, doesn't need very much in the way of processing. So it might just be the little bit of mid-cut and we're sorted. Sounds good to me. Just kind of messing with the Q and the cut value there a little bit. It's done most of the work. So let's listen now to those two mics together, and I'm going to pull the snare bottom track a lot further down so that we can get a good balance. I'm going to turn off the transient designer and it will sound like this. Cool. So I think that's in a pretty good place there for EQ. I'm now going to have a little listen to what happens if we chuck some compression and some saturation onto it. And then, well, I really like this little trio of plugins here in the Slate virtual mix rack. I've been using this a lot. Been using it on, well, I use it on the Periphery record, among other things. We've got this kind of SSL style compressor. We've got the presence part of this custom series lift, which as far as I can tell is mostly doing like a kind of 4 and a bit K wide boost. It's not an area I typically reach for boosting, and I think I kind of like that about this kind of one knob aspect, because it's something I wouldn't normally do, and it can be really good for just kind of dialing in how much forwardness you want on the snare sound. And then I like this Hollywood virtual tube collection kind of console saturation module that they have. There's loads of saturation modules even within this, but to be honest, you can use anything, just from a completely clean clipper to a tape emulation. It's all going to do a similar job of taking some of the transient off the drum. So first things first, let's pop this on, turn the ratio up to 4 or 5, and then let's give this snare quite a lot of compression. Sounding pretty cool. I'm going to turn up the saturation. So what I'm finding here is there's a point beyond which I'm not really liking the character of the sound anymore, but there's still a little bit too much of this kind of quite brief blippy kind of transient on the snare drum. So I'm going to go into the snare top where that transient's probably living, and I'm going to use a transient designer again to cut that back a little bit. Cool, that's sounding good to me. And I feel like maybe I could do something with a transient designer on the snare bottom as well, just kind of even out the response of the wires a little bit. So let's try, just cutting the attack and maybe boosting a bit of sustain on the bottom. Cool, that's sounding really good to me. I think what I want to do now is just listen to how that snare's sitting in the mix. finding is that there's a slightly kind of ratty character to the snare bottom. There's kind of like maybe 5K-ish kind of thing that's a little bit harsh. I'm wanting the snare to have a little bit more presence. But I feel like if I were to turn up the knob on that EQ I was showing you, the slate one, it would probably bring out more and more of that ratty kind of character. So I'm going to go in on the snare bottom channel and see if I can find that frequency range, cut it a little bit, and then try adding it back on that slate CS lift module on the snare bus. That's sounding pretty good. There's, you know, always in my mixing, there's always this kind of balancing phase where you're kind of judging, adding more presence to the overall snare close mic sound versus the snare bottom level and snare bottom EQ. So there I was kind of pulling the snare bottom mic down and down, which is revealing more of the kind of attack which is coming through on the snare top, and then EQing more of that kind of presence frequency area in on the virtual mix rack module there. So I'm feeling like that's settling pretty well into the mix. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to do. I'm just going to activate this send, which is from the snare top only to a snare reverb channel, which I've got. I'm not sending the bottom to it because I quite like having less of a fizzy character to the snare reverb these days. So if I were to take a listen to that. And I'm actually going to grab another instance of this FabFilter EQ here. And just, this has now gone on the snare bus before the compressor. I'm just going to go over that frequency range, that frequency content one more time just to see how we're looking. And I think in context that's going to work pretty well. I just kind of cut a little bit of that kind of 3K clackiness. And if I chuck the snare room trigger back in again. Cool. I'm not saying it's absolutely done. If I were to be mixing, a song for the first time, first song on a record, it would take me a day or so of kind of doing a mix and then listening to it outside of here while making lunch or whatever, and just kind of checking over and over that I'm happy with the character. And the snare drum would be one of the principal things I'd be listening for, is just that balance of like attack versus sitting into the mix. But for me, that snare's got a cool character, really different to where we started. And well, yeah, hopefully that's useful to anyone out there that's using Invasion and maybe not getting the snare sounds that they're after just yet. So the other thing I thought I could do is take a look at one of our other libraries called Modern and Massive, which is one of our really popular ones. It's a smaller, kind of more rock-focused library. And I just thought it would be cool to look at because it's a very different kind of recording. Different drums, different kind of tunings, really. But more than anything, different mics on the snare top and bottom. We've actually got one of those Josephson condenser mics that I use on toms as the snare top microphone on this library. And being a condenser, it's just got a slightly different frequency response. You kind of find that, the cuts and the locations of the cuts that you make on the snare top especially are going to be a little bit different with that. So I thought it could be a cool little thing for me to do. I won't go as in depth with my explanation because you've seen me go through this once already. But yeah, same thing, got rid of all the kit apart from the stock snare, which is the Ludwig. And just got the snare top and bottom channels running. Same exact MIDI. And this is how it sounds. Cool. So let's go in there. I'm going to do exactly the same process. So Pro Q3 on the snare top, and I'm going to chuck on that transient designer which I had waiting for me. So for me now, it's like it's a slightly higher up frequency that's leading the sound like that. Well, I'll show you. Like even with that bell boost muted, like even with that muted, I feel like you still got quite a predominant kind of knocking kind of character coming through there. This is slightly kind of muddiness to the attack, so I'm thinking it's probably a little bit lower than the 500 we cut before. There's a bit of clack. There's not too much of that kind of like ticky character that was in the other one, but there is a slight kind of, yeah, like kind of upper mid-range kind of harshness to it. So yeah, with that bypassed, the transient designer bypassed, this drum has no need for any low-end emphasis. That's already got quite a big amount of kind of low-end punch. That's probably the condenser, microphone, the tuning, and just like I say, every recording is different. So snare top done for now. Let's listen to the snare bottom with the transient designer on. That's the area I was hearing first. I don't really have a problem with it apart from that. Yeah, it sounds pretty good. So I'm actually going to do a bit of EQ. Just listening to that, I'm feeling like it's not got as much kind of cut as the other one did. It's quite nice and fat sounding, but I've got a feeling we're going to need it just to be a little bit more kind of upfront. And maybe that low kind of fundamental tone needs to actually be nipped back a little bit. It feels a little bit dominant in the sound. Chuck the transient designer back on again. For me, it's instantly so much easier to hear what's going on. Without there, I was kind of searching around a little bit because you're distracted by the kind of psh of the snare bottom and the kind of overtone. It's just difficult to have your ear remember exactly the kind of frequency ranges that were sticking out in the start. Not impossible, but difficult. All right, same trifecta here. Saturation's bringing out that slightly ugly overtone. Let's see if we can find that one. Sounding good. Still a little bit of tickiness that I don't like. I'm going to go in with the Transient Designer on the snare top again. See, I still feel like there's a slightly kind of harsh attack character to this snare. Yeah, it's just not entirely doing it for me. It might be that I've overdone this this present control thing. I feel like that's better, but there's still something going on up here that I'm not super into. Let's like that, I think. I think that's sounding really good. You know, it still sounds like the mono massive snare sound. There's always going to be a certain amount of character that's just there in the source track, and if you don't like the source character, then you're probably better off finding a different source if you can, than just kind of. I mean, personally, I'm not a huge fan of layering up lots of unrelated samples together to get a new snare sound. I kind of like my snare tone to primarily come from one source, maybe one or two little additional samples, one-shots, just to give it a slightly different character. But yeah, I tend to like to find a single source and make that sound as good as it can, and for that to be the snare sound on a given track. But yeah, let's just do a quick little A/B to how it was sounding pre-processing and post. So if I bypass those. I don't know if the same goes for you guys, but for me, all I can hear are those clacky frequencies that we cut early on, and that's exactly the stuff which the Transient Designer made it really easy for us to hear. So popping all the processing back on again, starting from raw. So there you go. I mean, I'm pretty happy with that. Like I say, just as with the Invasion snare, that's unlikely to be the final snare sound that I'd use on a project, but I think it's a damn good way towards a final snare sound. And just more than anything, I hope that these little techniques of the Transient Designer and the vocalizations of the sounds will help you quickly zero in on what you don't like in a sound, and get it over the finish line so much quicker than just kind of trial and error, or enable you to get more out of a source that you're provided with, and be able to get kind of more unique snare sounds on every record by not relying on the same samples or the same supporting samples, or trying to use the same preset and finding it doesn't work as well on some projects as on others, and not really knowing what to do. So yeah, loads of waffling, but I hope there's some good info in there for you. And if there's any other stuff you'd like to know about mixing wise, please let us know. I'm kind of set up to do tutorials a bit more frequently now. So if I've got the time, I'll be very willing to go into kind of any aspects of my mix process. So, leave some comments on the video too if you found this useful, if you think it's rubbish, if you think I waffled too much, if you think you needed more explanation. All of that would be really good stuff to know going into filming future videos. And yeah, for now, hope this serves you guys. And yeah, I'll see you around.